Welcome back to Secret Weapons, and today we're taking a look at the AEROS Looper Gold Edition by Singular Sound. I feel like my relationship with loopers has ebbed and flowed over the years. Like I'm sure any of you who are on guitar Instagram more than 7 years ago, know that most of our first forays into any kind of recording were sticking a looper at the end of your signal chain before your amplifier, and that was essentially recording. You would build a spacey ambient track into that little, often like a ditto looper, and then just record it with your cell phone and put it on Instagram. And that was 90% of Instagram music in the mid 2010s. If you were there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And as I graduated out of that workflow, out of the kind of looper as a recording exercise and into my DAW, I found that my kind of like patience for the looper workflow really diminished, which is a shame because that stream of consciousness, kind of frictionless recording process of a good looper is incredibly rewarding when you really find that groove. And I think the intro track of this video kind of showcases how that can feel, where you aren't fiddling around in your DAW, where you're just kind of running through tracks and quickly printing ideas in front of you. The problem is, for me at least, so much of the looper workflow, that stream of consciousness is inhibited by a lack of control. At their most basic, some loopers won't even let you undo. Whatever you've played is whatever you have in front of you, and if you want to undo it, you're either required to have some sort of external controller to access that parameter, or you just have to start over. And similarly, there's no nuance, in my opinion, to a lot of loopers' playback engine. Different parts should not be the same volume, and the inability to set different volumes in post frustrates me because it's a lot of work to fine-tune the volume for your next part before you've played it. Being able to mix it in post is one of the main reasons that I, graduated out of looping and into a DAW. So for me to kind of like re-engage with the looper world, especially the looper world as a kind of like writing workflow beyond just kind of like an experimental looper that is meant to kind of chop up and skew and recontextualize individual guitar parts, I needed something that really made it feel like it was worth my time. When Singular Sound reached out to me a long time ago at this point, sorry guys, about doing a video on the AEROS Looper Gold Edition, I'll be honest with you guys, I was skeptical about it. Like I said, I had been out of that looping game for a while. I'm very comfortable in my DAW workflow, but one, I wanted a challenge, and two, I watched a couple of videos on this thing, of which there are a lot of really good ones out there, and I highly recommend a couple that I will link in the description down below if you want further kind of reading on this subject. But this thing is no joke. Let's talk about the Singular Sound AEROS and what the insane feature set in this looper is. First things first, let's talk about the physical setup of this device. This is a touchscreen, which is amazing. You have this big wheel over here, which is both master loop volume and also an essential piece. You'll notice it's shredded here. An essential piece of what I consider to be the hands-free workflow for this thing. You have 4 foot switches, a play-stop master control that can also be used to erase and reset your loop entirely, and then 3 foot switches that can be used contextually to navigate menus on this thing, or very quickly arm a loop, start a recording, press and hold to enter a menu to do things like undo, reverse, or enter. And this is the fun part, your mixer window. We'll come back to that. And then along the top, you have your 9-volt input, your expression input, because you have an assignable expression control in this thing, your MIDI in, your MIDI out, which is key and crucial, and your stereo in, your stereo out. And then around the side, you have your USB, your stereo in and out for your auxiliary audio, which can either be something of a loop or the ability to bring in another instrument entirely. You could use this thing with a mono guitar, a mono bass, and a stereo keyboard all in one setup with no repatching. Or you could do what I did, which is manually switch between inputs for the top, or run something like your bass into that side jack and have all of your instruments kind of run into one looper. And did I mention that that aux out can also be used to send click? So if you're using a mixer after this, you could send this looper to the rest of your band, as well as a separate click to keep everybody on track with your loop, or just to keep yourself on track with a quantized loop in this thing, because of course you can do free-form or quantized looping in this device. And there's some really great features once you've laid that first loop track down. Like I said, you can reverse and undo, you can mute, you can solo individual tracks. And when I say individual tracks, this thing has a 6x6 mode or a 2x2 mode. And that 6x6 is basically a 6-track recorder with 6 individual layers of audio you can record, overdub on, reset the levels on them. So you can do post-processing in this thing for some live remixing of your various levels. You can do so much with this thing that this is one of the only loopers I am willing to engage with as a songwriting tool in the modern context. And that's not hyperbole, and that's not a joke. Like, I love my creative kind of short form loopers, things like the Mood Mark II. And I love things like the Chase Plus Blooper as a mono creative thing for feeding 3 chords, a handful of notes, and then just kind of mangling it into ambient nonsense. But like, that's really fun, but I don't find that I personally, I should say, don't find a lot of value for those kinds of things as a songwriting exercise, as a method for writing something that is a little bit more long form and that has the capacity to go places. And as you heard on that intro track, this thing is a lot more capable of all that stuff. And in the time that I've had this, there have been like 3 significant firmware updates that have come out where they have added new features, they have corrected for bugs. I have heard rumors that there is panning on the way for this device, which would be huge. On that intro track, you noticed I was fiddling around with the Empress ZOIA. The only thing I was using it for was panning my stereo guitar center left, center right, and properly center, just to give some added dimension and space to the track I was putting together. But there are whispers that that will be involved in a future firmware update for the AEROS. And like I said, in the time I've had it, I've seen a lot of really great firmware updates for it. In the firmware for this thing, there are literally dozens of menus. There is a lot of stuff to dig into in this looper that I, quite frankly, don't feel fully qualified to be able to dig into. So instead, what we are going to do is really get like a nice tight shot on the looper on my pedal board, and we are going to write something a lot more simple than what we did at that intro, more just kind of dry guitar, and we're going to talk through kind of the way that I like to navigate this thing, the features that I find to be very, very immediately useful. I'm somebody who pulls apart and rebuilds boards frequently, and to get everything out of this thing, I think, requires a more dedicated workflow and a more focused kind of building around the looper as a looper. But for what I do, I actually think there's a really great plug and play workflow in this thing. And so I want to showcase what specific features, especially as hands-free features, I find to be really, really useful for kind of that stream of consciousness, but with polish workflow that I find to be very, very cool about the AEROS. So let's get into it. So let's talk through our signal chain really quick before we get into our sound samples. I am playing my Harmony Jupiter thin line guitar into the Cali 76 compressor by Origin, the Universal Audio Dream, the Hologram Microcosm, the UA Galaxy, the Neunaber Illumine reverb, and the Empress ZOIA into the AEROS looper. Everything's pretty straightforward here. The idea behind this board was clean tones and a lot of great tools for some ambience, but selective ambience. The Galaxy is being used for delay, obviously. The Illumine is being used for just a splash of plate reverb like this. Just that little bit of that vintage digital reverb, actually. And then the ZOIA is actually being used basically just as panning presets to sound like this. Allowing me to kind of just like pan the incoming stereo signal, middle left, middle right, or perfectly stereo. And The nice thing about the looper is it handles all of that really well, and because you have all those individual tracks, you can then set levels for each of those as you continue to kind of walk through things. Let's go ahead and start building out something incredibly simple and straightforward and playing with the feature set in this thing. So we're going to turn clock on in my DAW, which is feeding through my headphones, because the looper is clocked to our DAW as still, and is then passing that MIDI clock on through to the microcosm. But we're not going to play with the microcosm and all that stuff at this exact moment, unless we feel like getting weird with it. But we're just going to record some kind of mostly clean guitars, and then with some panning stuff from the ZOIA, and then we will kind of start playing with some of the features in this thing. So right off the bat, you'll notice that we actually extended out the length of that first loop just by not hitting that overdub. So your overall loop length is not locked in stone with your first part. You can stretch it out further if you want to kind of create something that goes longer than that original kind of, 3 or 4 chord pattern, that kind of thing. Let's jump over to our left side and add something else. A little bit of delay. And of course, that doesn't have to be the new complete full length. That can actually run at the original length if you want it to, and it will internally double itself to kind of keep pace with the longest iteration of the loop. And like I've said, one of the things that I really love about this thing is how hands-free you can get even without a MIDI controller. Like if I had the Singular Sound companion controller, I could do a ton of stuff very quickly. But even in the current context, I can just hold down. Oh, hold on. Part, there we go. Play, we gotta turn that overdub off. There we go. Like I said, having the external thing makes some of this workflow stuff a lot more intuitive and quick. But even with this, the AEROS as standalone, I can press and hold that second button right there. Jump up to my mixer with the scroll wheel and re-level some of these tracks. And there's other stuff you can do in there as well. Some really great stuff. One of my favorites is, of course, being able to reverse a track. So let's leave that on. Let's go to the microcosm, as you can hear. And so let's just kind of add some really washy bed stuff to this. On its own track. And of course, you could always undo something if you feel like you made a mistake. Right there, all we did was undo that kind of like end of track overdub. We can also re-overdub. And you can add stuff to individual tracks so that you can kind of almost like gang individual parts to a single one that you can then kind of mix in post. So I could go, okay, I want more of that, but I want it panned with the ZOIA. Let's overdub that. And now let's pan it to the other side and add another layer to the same exact track. Again, in this context, we can go into our, I mean, we could even do something cool like solo up just that really washy craziness. Or we can do something like, obviously, unsolo it. Or fade that one out to get back to a closer, and you can set your fade times and all that stuff in the menus and the configuration stuff for this looper. But we can have a moment of a little bit of quiet. And then bring it back in. Yeah, in the world of DAW-less music production, recording, that kind of stuff, I really like how kind of like feature-rich and how much kind of post-production control you have in this thing. I'm not a big fan of loopers that are really like printed and move on with your life, and the AEROS is very much a fine-tune and kind of get everything sitting really beautifully in your mix as you go, which I really, really appreciate.